again, everybody. Chuck the Comic Guy here, bringing you another episode of the Chuck the Comic Guy podcast. I'm multitasking over here and trying to remember my words. It is June 9th already. I feel like I'm losing track of everything. This is the time of year where things get kind of chaotic. I think we all get a little chaotic this time of year. It's summer. We're all stuck in our homes for most of the year, so we want to get out and do things. We have graduation parties. You have all kinds of, I'm sure, birthdays pop up, all celebrations, cookouts, baseball, if you enjoy that kind of thing too. So it's definitely been a busy month already. It's hopefully going to start simplifying itself here pretty soon, but I don't think that's really, I'm being facetious and thinking that that's going to ever happen. So I'm really just trying to get as much covered and keep up with the routine of doing podcasts while my schedule has openings. I apologize if my postings are not as, I still have been doing pretty good keeping up with my social media, which while I'm on that note, Chuck the Comic Guy, Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Substack. I feel like I've been slacking, but I still try to keep a daily presence on there. So I'm doing my best to keep up with everything. Just usually I have this huge thing that happens with me where things get too chaotic and I don't want to back out on anything. I'm sticking to this. I'm not going to, sometimes I feel like I need a break, but I know I can push through it, and that's not a very good message to send along to anybody. You should take a break if you need one. But I know my limits. I have not hit that yet. June is just a crazy month. So anyway, moving along. Thank you to anybody who is listening and commenting and keeping up. I always give my gracious thank yous to everybody. I appreciate everybody who just is interactive and helping to keep me inspired and motivated to keep going on with this podcast and all my postings and everything else. And I wouldn't be doing this if there wasn't any kind of motivation like that. So thank you. I also wanted to, it's still Pride Month. I had a little excerpt of what I was talking about with Pride Month last episode. I'm not going to just do it one time and say that's it. I covered Pride Month for 1 week. I definitely want to just still recognize it as Pride Month. It would be, if it was any other occasion or holiday, I would recognize it throughout that month as well. But it is a very important time of the year to recognize the LGBTQ community. And I wanted to take a minute to give you a little insight on my influences growing up as a kid. And most of my childhood is very much kind of a very, I'm trying to think of the way to describe this. I guess most of my influence to this day is very ingrained and enriched in my childhood. And I think that's very honest for anybody, really. There's a lot of influence that comes from your youth that you carry with you. And you also have a lot of adult things that come along in life too, that is kind of like this perfect mesh of your childhood ambitions and likes and dreams mixed in with your adult goals and life. And so this podcast is a very good encapsulation of kind of that in itself, because I enjoyed comic book. My childhood was very cool. I don't want to rub it into anybody's face by saying that. Anybody who grew up in the 80s or the 90s, we were very fortunate to have the 80s and 90s be our childhood. Anybody that grew up in the 70s and 60s would probably say that, yeah, you may think that was cool. We had cooler things too, but just the stuff that it was just a very overwhelming experience as a kid with toys, movies, cartoons, music. And I just, so much of that has been instilled in me through all my life. I always look back at some of those memories and just think I wouldn't be where I'm at now with some of those memories. And regarding Pride Month, I want to also just say that my biggest musical influence has been since 93, and I wasn't really that attentive to it at that time, but after the fact, I became very well attached to this person and band is Kurt Cobain, who he was he was a generational icon, not just for his music, but for his messages in his music and his pure honesty with anybody regarding what he felt and believed. And I don't think a lot of people realize, unless you are as diehard of a Nirvana fan that I am, some of his ethical beliefs. And part of this ties into Pride Month because the 90s was kind of a very evolutionary period where the it wasn't even LGBTQ, it was just pretty much LGB at that point, and it wasn't even really recognized by the letters. It was more just kind of the names of gay or lesbian or bi. It was kind of it was becoming this very big movement of that time to be open with your sexuality and be more expressive about it. RuPaul was one of the big drag icons of that time. And that kind of opened this doorway, the floodgates opened for the LGBTQ community at that point. And it was, I will read something out of the album Incesticide's booklet that when I was a kid, and I didn't have very many peers and or adults that influenced me by any means, like in my life, that I could look to or go to for guidance. I just kind of had my friends that weren't really, I wouldn't say they were bad friends, but they just weren't very influential friends. We just all hung out and just did dumb stuff and played video games and all those things. So I had to find this outlet to kind of find someone that was almost like a parental figure in my life, that was, because the people I had in my life were just kind of very quiet to themselves. So I didn't have very much input from them. And when I heard Nirvana in the back of the bus when I was in middle school, because that was when it was a big thing, and everybody had their tapes and their CDs, and you'd hear it like that, and everybody else, all the other bands were popular at the time, I really attached myself to Nirvana because everything about it just felt like it was part of my identity at that point. And so when I obtained all the albums and everything else, it was a very cool thing to do, was to go through the liner notes or the booklets that came with the CDs or the cassettes. And there was one booklet that I have right in front of me that I'm going to read that kind of helped me into a period of time where I've kind of found a way of thinking that was more pragmatic and more reasonable and definitely more influential to me. So I'm going to read this thing, and I'm going to clean one word out of it because I don't want to really swear on the podcast, just for anybody who has kids in the car or whatever you guys are listening to. But so Kurt writes in this booklet for the album Incesticide. I know it's always a funny name to read. He just kind of goes about an experience of the band at that point, and he goes to talk about some things to his fans, and he never was very afraid to speak his mind. So he says, at this point, I've made a request to our fans. If any of you in any way hate homosexuals, people of different color, or women, please do us one favor and leave us alone. I took one word out of there just because, again, that was important to me. It was actually very significant to me as a child, a teenage, like a preteen, basically being like 11 or 12 years old, that I read that, and I didn't have anybody that was of an adult nature that really instilled very many values to me. And that being a person I admire his music and his talent, and I wanted to very much be like him as a kid and learn how to play guitar like he did and play the music that he did, which I eventually in the long run kind of figured that all out for myself. That was important to me, and it very made me open-minded about things regarding people and how to treat people and be better about treating people right. And that was because you didn't have that messaging. If you were a kid in the 90s, you didn't very have many friends that were that important in terms of they didn't have that kind of value to them. They would just kind of just fall in line with whatever it was that they thought was cool. And sometimes some of the things they thought were cool were not, especially nowadays. And so that was very important. And that was really what made me open my eyes to be more respectful towards people and to recognize more different diverse groups of people, especially the LGBTQ community. So I owe it to him to be a more well-rounded person, even though some people would say, geez, that's crazy. You don't even know the guy, but that's totally cool. It's just sometimes we all have like that one person you're probably never going to meet in your life that probably found a way to shape you in some weird way from a message they sent to you, whether it's via music or comic books or movies or an actor or whatever. Sometimes you don't want to meet those people because you don't know whether they're purely genuine. And I guess I am fortunate that I will never be able to meet him and find out if there was anything ungenuine about him. So that to me is kind of maybe a blessing in disguise of sorts. But that was a part of me that made me be more respectful. And I think there's a lot of people in my generation that read the same liner notes and it made them more open-minded about things. So I want to just be able to put that out there for Pride Month. That's what made me feel more accepting of diverse groups of people, is his influence, because I didn't want to be that fan that was not being a true fan to him. So if you're a person that just has never listened to their music, give him a listen. And now know that there's this little part of history in his liner note that was pretty cool. And, you know, a lot of people probably don't realize that. So I wanted to throw that out there about him. If you didn't know anything about him as an artist or a person and didn't know that that was his take on things, there's one more facet to him that makes him very truly unique. And he was a big proponent of the LGBTQ movement in the 90s. And we wouldn't even probably be as far into this now without his influence. So thank him wherever he's at. So transitioning along, I wanted to mention that today is Tuesday, the 9th. So tomorrow is New Comic Book Day, Wednesday, and there's going to be stuff hitting the shelves. I've been very optimistically hopeful going into the store. I went earlier this week because I missed a couple things I meant to get last Wednesday, and I picked them up. It feels like there's just that 1 week where there's just everything you want, and then you have to kind of be patiently waiting every other week to find something that hits the shelves for New Comic Book Day. And that's been kind of in me because I already kind of hit a lot of the things I wanted to get from last month's stuff that was coming out, and now we're going to start getting some more new stuff this week. Youngblood 100, I've been doing my best to be very supportive of that and push that as much as I can, because I think that's really just kind of Rob Liefeld is the creator of Youngblood. He's been doing everything on his social media to promote this. He's been going to Whatnot shows. I've been buying his Whatnot auctions when I can. And that's been one of like the few Whatnots I've been purchasing lately. And it's very cool that he hit the 100 milestone for a guy who came into the comic book industry. Well, he'll tell you 41. I think 41 years is what he's been saying on his podcast. But he really was a big proponent of the X-Force, New Mutants when he came into the fold of things, and then he went into Image, and so Youngblood 100 is kind of, with everything he's doing with it, is basically it's Image kind of coming together to make Youngblood 100 this big milestone because of all the different artists that he's got for variant covers, and just it's kind of like the whole Youngblood was basically the first book to hit Image Comics, and we would probably at some point have had some of the titles we have now that are newer, like Invincible and Walking Dead and other titles that have come through Image or Wildcats or what have you. But Rob Liefeld kind of was the front runner for Image, and then it became Spawn, Wildcats, Walking Dead, Invincible, all these other comics and titles that came out of there, that Battle Beast, and all the Robert Kirkman stuff, who felt very influenced by Rob's work. And so I'm excited that that's going to hit stores tomorrow. I've already kind of pre-ordered some stuff last month or so for 100, and there's legacy issues. There's all the different variants. So it's going to be really cool. And I suggest that you definitely get out there and hit your comic book store this weekend or this Wednesday, and also look for other stuff, because I don't know when Dork 5 is going to hit. I'm hoping tomorrow. I'm not good at keeping track of what comes out when, and I'm definitely excited for that. But going back to everything for this week. So I've got some news updates, and I'll kind of backtrack to some of the stuff I was just talking about hitting the comic book store that I hit this week to get some back issue stuff. So news, I don't have very many news stories to cover except for one being He-Man Masters of the Universe was released in the last week to theaters. And just like everything else, it is considered, and I'm going to air quote this, bombed in terms of its return on investment. It had $170 to $200 million budget going into this thing. And He-Man is kind of like one of those it's in those weird limbo of fandoms where it was basically the big action figure crate, like fad or trade or whatever you want to consider it, before all the big action figure lines came out. And there was other things that were in there in that mix, but He-Man action figures were kind of the predecessor to the Ninja Turtles, to the Toy Biz Marvel lines. Just that with everything they did with the action figures, they were pretty inventive in how they were created with all the different features that each character had, and some of them were just really crazy for that time. And then you had the cartoon that coincided with the action figure line, so that was just that whole thing. And then of course every cartoon and action figure line hits a roadblock at some point because the next new thing hits, and then it just becomes just okay, moving on, that's old, this is new, we don't want to touch that anymore. And then the toy creators try to get so overly creative that they just almost go away from their identity, and then just kind of falls apart because they try to do everything they can to be up to date with the new lines, and they try some weird outside of the box stuff, and then it just doesn't really land well, and then it just becomes like, well, that's it, we're done. So going back to He-Man the movie that just came out, a $200 million budget, and they only brought in on opening weekend $54 million. And I say only because that's just ridiculous, that thinking that $54 million is pretty substantial to any random person, including myself. I would be fine if someone just dropped $54 million in my lap. I would be pretty upset if I spent $170 to $200 million to get that $54 million, but still, I probably would never spend it at all. And I had to put this in perspective because we're too ingrained into this idea that these movies that are coming out now that have some sort of property or IP to them that is reminiscent of childhood fandoms like He-Man or Ghostbusters or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, any of those things. It's crazy to know that this film, for one, it's getting great reviews. Honestly, for anybody that's a fan to most critics, you had to go against the original film that really just kind of was like the nail in the coffin for He-Man at that point, because it was almost a little too late when the Dolph Lundgren film of He-Man came out, or Masters of the Universe. They didn't really reference He-Man in it that much except for his character, but they didn't put it really in the title. It was just Masters of the Universe, which I think didn't do too well for it, to be honest, because I think everybody just refers to him as He-Man, and they just put the Masters of the Universe as it's in the background somewhere. But that film did not do very well because it didn't translate great to the cartoon. It was too much of like a fish out of water story where He-Man's walking around in New York or wherever sort of city he's in, and he's just lost, and he's trying to get back to Eternia and all that. And see, they kind of did the same thing here, but they did it a much better, more fashionable way of doing it, and they still kind of linked more Eternia stuff to it. I have not seen it because I'm waiting, and I'm a part of the problem to that $54 million. I've said this before, and I say it again. I have better things to spend my money on, unfortunately, as much as I want to spend them at movie theaters. I think this has just become, it's not just me. I'm just saying from my perspective, there's just not a reason to sit in a crowded movie theater when you don't know whether the audience is going to cooperate, whether someone's going to bring some crying child into the theater that you don't want, and then next thing you know, ruins the effect. You just don't know whether you're going to get kicked in the back of the seat. And this has always been a problem for movie theaters, and not just a modern day problem, but it's just become more of a, you're spending more money to get kicked in the back of the seat to hear in the crane. It's just, I've seen too many films recently where it kind of ruined the experience. Even if they put the recliner seats and more space between the seats and all that, which I think also doesn't help either, because you had these giant theaters that had a whole bunch of seats, and then they did all the stuff during pandemic or after COVID or whatever, where they took half the seating out, and then they put all these fancy recliner seats in there, and then they put a VIP section somewhere in the theater, and they do all these things to make it more like some sort of very special event where it's just, you just want to sit down and watch a movie. I get that it's not very comfortable to sit in those old seats, but we've done it for so long that we should be just fine with it. They didn't really have to give us these special luxury recliner seats, to be honest, but they just did it anyway to kind of make it like, this is what we're upcharging you for now. And it's just become the trend that all these films that have some special thing that's linked to a video game or TV show or whatever, they have to have a large budget to make it work for the sake of doing it justice. Because if you went any shorter of that budget, there'd probably be so many things they would have had to leave out on the cutting room floor. So it's just, it stinks that these movies that supposedly bomb are just bombing because they're just not getting the seats filled fast enough, rather than being, it almost represents that the movie is a flop, is what they consider, or a bombed movie. And it's not necessarily the case, especially with this that's getting good reviews. It just stinks that nobody wants to go spend money, a lot of money, go to a theater when you're just going to get it to streaming a month later, or to DVD 2 months later. And then it's just, now you can own it. And you can, I've said this many times before, there doesn't make it, it's not a good decade or era for the modern movie theater, because it just seems like, why do you rush everything so quickly down the line? If I had to wait 6 months, I would probably go and wait a couple weeks and then see it when it's not opening weekend. And the opening weekend thing is kind of, especially with the way that the theaters are smaller, it's becoming a little bit more of a challenge to, if you really have to see something, to get in there and not feel like you're crowded or you're fighting a line. Or because I know how it is trying to get into a theater right now. You have to book your seats in advance online. You buy your tickets that way, and you pick your seats on the little touch screen and all that, which is fun and cool because at least you get to pick a seat. But then if you get into a position, and this doesn't help the theater industry either, that, oh, great, the only seats that are available are the ones that are the break your neck looking up at the screen the whole entire movie in the front row. I don't want to buy those seats, so they're just going to sit there stagnant, basically, and you'd be lucky if someone wants to get those tickets. They'll just wait the next screening and try to get the better seats at that point, which maybe they could do a better job, maybe with some of the way that the seats are laid out, which they kind of have with these bigger seats, I guess. Is just, there used to be that one thing where back in the day, you go to a movie theater, I'm not sitting in the front row because my neck is going to be sore by the end of the movie, and it's 2 hours long. I wanted to equate this film to another film that was a summer blockbuster, and going back to my youth from speaking earlier, a summer blockbuster of the, I think it was 89, 90, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Honey, I Shrunk the Kids was just this random movie, and it had Rick Moranis, and he was the star of it. I mean, everybody in the movie was great, but he was the selling point of it, and that was in basically his biggest peak period of acting, from going from Spaceballs and other things he was involved with. As it was a big deal because the trailer, and I think that's the other thing too, is we're almost getting spoiled by too many trailers being or too many leaks or too many things going all over social media of the films. Because in the last week since He-Man has been in theaters, I've been scrolling through TikTok, and I'm already seeing the post-credit scenes. I'm trying not to see it, so I keep trying to scroll past it, but you can't avoid it. You start seeing parts of the movie that you don't want to see, and it kind of ruins it for you if you already, oh, that's one scene that I was looking forward to seeing. It wasn't in the trailer. And back in the day, you didn't have what we have now. And when Honey, I Shrunk the Kids came out, I remember as a 10-year-old kid, seeing the trailer, seeing all the crazy things that were happening in the trailer, and I just thought, I mean, everybody saw what I saw, and we were like, we have to get to the theater and see that movie. And I remember going, pretty sure it was opening weekend, because it was chaos to find a seat in that theater. I was lucky to get one good seat with my mom at that time, and it was just, I at that point it was what you see now with movies like Doomsday or Endgame or Infinity War. That theater was just filled to the brim with people, and they were all excited, and there's not that excitement anymore. You just kind of, movie watching in a theater is just kind of an experience that you just do just for the sake of saying you did it, and okay, cool, I'm part of the crowd that went and seen it opening weekend or whatever. And it just doesn't have that same thrill and excitement like it used to. But the one thing I wanted to mention about Honey, I Shrunk the Kids was the budget. And I looked this up earlier just because I was just curious. Again, everything is dialed back a bit because of inflation and the cost of everything in the 90s compared to now. You would have to think that probably the budget, if you were to do it scaled up, would probably be like threefold. So, but anyway, to make Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, which of its time was to kids and to people of that generation was like, wow, how did they make that happen? How did they make the people look so small in these giant things? How did they make the lawnmower scene look like the lawnmower scene? If you haven't seen it, that scene was insane to watch on a big screen. $18 million to make that movie back in 89, 90. And it returned on investment $200 million plus. I think the actual total number was $220 million that movie brought back in from box office, and in long term in general, but mostly that weekend or whatever from in general box office sales. That 200, it made the same amount of money of its time that went into the He-Man film of this week, which is insane because it just is wild to think 18 million turned into 200 million, but 200 million turned to 54 million. And the reviews, I mean, I think Honey to Shrunk the Kids had a better review altogether because of just, it's like an iconic film of its time now. And He-Man could easily have been that if the marketing and the people they picked to play. I think the other thing too is there's a kind of, Jared Leto is Skeletor. You don't even see Jared Leto. You just know he's doing the voice, and he's all done up in like a Skeletor thing, whatever. And anybody else in that film, you don't even know who they are if you don't pay attention close enough to who they are. I don't know them because I'm not of that generation. I'm sure people younger than me will say, oh yeah, I know all the people in that film. I don't know. I guess to me, it was a better, I guess the guy who's playing He-Man, which I didn't even write down because I didn't think I'd get this far with it. But yeah, so let me look up that because I want to make sure I get this correct. Prince Adam. Nicholas. Why is it every time I go to look up a random name and it's got to be like a normal name and then some crazy last name? It's every time. Nicholas Galitzine. There we go. And Camila Mendez is Tila. So it's just funny. I notice I do that every time I look up a name, and I was like, great, another name I can't pronounce. Congratulations. Again, I don't know. Other than Jared Leto, I'm a 44-year-old guy. I am pretty reasonable who I do know that's younger, and mostly the people I do that are older. And I couldn't tell you half that cast from just looking at them. Again, I had to Google one of them, and the main star basically. And it could be one of those things. This is his role that pivots him into so many other things. But then the unfortunate thing is that this is considered a bombed film, so he's probably not going to get work anytime soon for a headlining role again. And it's unfortunate because that's not a true account or representation of what the film was. The film was fan service. The film was there to honor the diehards that have been waiting for. We've been waiting for an actual Masters of the Universe He-Man film since the 80s that was more accurately depicted to the cartoon. And it took them this long to do it. And had they hit this, if they had tried this 10 years ago, it would have been way better, because I'm sure that the return for box office sales would have been way better back then than they are now, because we're in this era, we're in this phase where nobody wants to go to a theater anymore. It's just, why spend the money when you can see it on your 72-inch or 79-inch or 84-inch Vizio that you bought from Walmart for $300, which is still insane to me, with your sound bar and in your basement of your like little man cave or whatever, and you could do it at your own time, at your own leisure. You can pull it up on whatever streaming service it's going to get pulled up on. And why did you have to stand in line or go online and pay for a ticket for you and your family and all that stuff? And they do all these things with those special buckets or whatever to try to get you in, like, if you're not going to enjoy the film for what it's worth, buy this special bucket for it or whatever. You have to, the fear of missing out items that are these other investment items that they're trying to get you invested in. And it just used to be so much more simpler than this. And I think that we just come to a point now that this generation just can't appreciate that there's too many things going on in our lives, that sitting down in a theater to watch a movie just for the sake of, and like having something to do because you're bored, is not an option anymore, because we're not bored. We've got way too many things to keep us unbored. And that was the thing that used to be our boredom cure, was going to the theater or going bowling or whatever. And now we are we're so in tune with so many things around us that we just, like, going to a theater is like the last thing in our mind, because we have way too many priorities or things to keep us occupied now. And yeah, that's unfortunate that it is being viewed in this light. It's, I mean, watching the trailer and certain clips I've seen, I would enjoy watching it. I am wanting to watch it. I just, not at a theater. So I'm part of the problem. I'm sorry. But I do want to support it in some way, and I will support it by buying the DVD and adding it to my collection, because I like doing that too. And until if they just did away with DVDs, this whole problem would be resolved, because we wouldn't be able to keep them, like buy the DVD to keep. So, but it goes to streaming too quickly. It goes to DVD too quickly. It's insane how many movies I see that I'm like, wow, it's already in store already. I just thought that came out like a month ago. How's it already on a shelf in Walmart for $12.99 or $12.48 or whatever they open it, or $19.48 or whatever they do the pricing on? So that's my take on He-Man and the movie industry in general. I know that we can guarantee that two films that are going to be above and beyond, hopefully for the sake of, I guess, cost, is going to be Spider-Man and Doomsday. Those two films are definitely going to get this. That will be the telling point after the Star Wars or the Grogu Mandalorian and this. Now, if we see a dip in sales for Doomsday or Spider-Man Brand New Day, if those don't hit their budget, then I think that we're in big trouble long term. I mean, in terms of what studios are going to actually start doing, because they're already trying to trim the amount of money they're putting in these projects, because everything is just kind of that way now. Marvel's already started to trim everything down over at Disney. Disney's trimmed down all the Marvel division stuff, because they're not seeing the return results on any of the films that have been coming out. Sony, I think, is going to be a little different, because Spider-Man is basically their cash cow. So they're not going to, I mean, they've already kind of cut out all the middle projects, whatever, and they're just going to focus probably strictly on video games and Spider-Man movies, or whatever crossovers happen with their Spider-Man character, to make money off of that. But it's going to be scary if for any reason that Doomsday, especially Doomsday with Robert Downey Jr. coming back, if that does not hit the mark that or the expectation that they have, there's already, and that's one more thing I'll talk about, this kind of a loose news story anyway. Marvel's already kind of announced that the MCU is going to reset after Doomsday, and they're going to, it's almost like wipe the slate clean. And that scares me, because it just reeks of, we're going back to what happened when Marvel first got into the film industry with the Fox stuff, with X-Men, with Blade. I fear they're going to kind of dial it back a bit on a budget level, and then we're probably not going to get the greatest rewards for films anymore, because they're kind of getting more grittier street level stuff that's going to be less CGI or special effects, and try to be a little bit more conventional, which I'm fine with. We don't have to have everything being extreme CGI by any means. I just fear that they're going to start realizing that these films that they put all this budget into special effects are not the payoff that they were getting anymore. And then they're going to start really kind of making the films look kind of like, as the kids say, mid. So that is a concern to me, that we're going to start kind of going backwards after Doomsday with Marvel projects. And then I think with James Gunn heading DC, it's gonna be like a mirror inverse of what happened when DC was putting out films that weren't really taking, like they weren't getting the same response as Marvel stuff is. I think it's gonna be completely Uno reverse here. It's gonna be, Marvel's gonna be now kind of back to where they were during the early 2000s when X-Men films were kind of and then DC projects were really good. And even though some of them were still duds, but James Gunn, I think, I think he's got a good ear to the ground of what's due to come. And there's actually a new Supergirl trailer that came out, speaking on that note, that kind of covers a little bit. I'm not trying to give it away, but it's out there. I mean, you probably have already encountered it without trying to encounter it. And it has a little bit more of the shows Clark Kent or Superman interacting with his cousin. So that's kind of cool to see that. And I think that's going to, I'm actually really excited to see Supergirl. That's the trailer. I wasn't as excited for it at first because I'm just not a big. I didn't never really followed Supergirl. I've never really been a big follower of DC. I'll watch their films when they come out or whatever when I get a chance. But I've never been big into like even Superman, the movies. I just had to always catch up from behind on if I really wanted to get up to speed on them. It had never been like something I have to see. I saw Superman Returns when that came out, either opening weekend or second week, and I was really excited because they kind of tried to make it as much as like the original Superman 70s and 80s films, and they did a really good job with it, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not saying it's the greatest Superman film, but for what they were trying to offer in terms of being cozy, trying to continue off of the original Christopher Reeves Superman films, I thought they did a good job trying to keep the continuity together. Continuity. That sounds so bad. Continuity. There we go. And so it's just, but then people didn't like that either. They wanted like just some sort of, let's just reboot it here and not try to continue with what the Christopher Reeves stuff is, because it seems like it's a little bit of a disservice doing that to Christopher Reeves. So it was just one of those things that I enjoyed it for the value of what it was, and then that basically nobody liked it, and it went right back to the reboot bin. So I'll see what happens when Supergirl comes out. I hope to catch it in theaters week 1 and actually give it some support, and it'll be cool, pretty cool. And then I'm also looking forward to a couple other things that are coming around the corner. Of course, obviously, Brand New Day, Supergirl. And see, I'm just so out of the loop of what else is coming up, and I know there's a lot of things that are in the works, so that are coming soon. But yeah, Supergirl and Brand New Day and Doomsday are my big 3, like I think many people's are. Moving along, I wanted to also go back to what I was discussing at the local comic store that I went to it was on Saturday or Sunday, one of those 2 days. I went over the weekend and I revisited it because I realized that I completely botched my shopping trip on Wednesday with and I was lucky to catch, they actually had 1 issue left and I was able to nab it while I was there. And I wanted to do 2 new issues and a reissue review. If that makes sense. So I read X-Men 97 Season 2 Issue 1, which I got to go back and get all the Season 1 issues. I was hoping they're going to have them in back issue format there, and that store doesn't really carry some of that stuff. It's either sold out or they just didn't have it in stock. But because it's a continuation of my X-Men Adventures fandom, and I have to keep going. I have to have them all. And so I got to go back and get all the Season 1 stuff because I also never watched that season on Disney, but I like to read the comics that coincide with it. But I posted that I read X-Men Season 2 Issue 1 on social media, on TikTok, and it was a fun little read. The artwork, I mean, I guess it lends itself well to what the animated series is trying to achieve. I've never been a fan of, like, I guess it goes back to Invincible. People do the comparisons of what Invincible's comic book line artwork, the comic book artwork looks like in comparison to the animated series artwork. Obviously, they have to speed up things to make it a little bit more easier to produce. So they, the details aren't into the final product of the animated stuff ever. It just kind of is, it's a lot of work to put together a cartoon. Not that I say that from experience, but just from knowing, it's just, you have to, I couldn't imagine what it's like to be an animator of a cartoon. And they kind of did the artwork is a little bit too cartoony for me, but I'm fine with it for the sake of story. The story was pretty good. It did definitely feel like X-Men 97, and there's some stuff in there is a little corny, but otherwise it was great. I'm excited to see what the next issue brings. I'm not going to watch the cartoon. I'm sure I will at some point, but I wanted to kind of read the comic book and connect the dots through that too. And so that was X-Men Season 2, Issue 1. Pretty cool. The cover was pretty nice too. I did notice that there's been a complaint about Marvel titles having some ads that are a little bit excessive in there. And I did see, like, if, there's, honestly, it's not as bad. There's some titles that come out with a lot of ads that are just like every other page. It's an ad. And comic books historically from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s would have a couple pages of reading and then boom, ad. Some people don't like it because the continuity to artwork isn't there. When you have an ad, that could be like a double panel that's a really action sequenced kind of thing. And they didn't do too bad with the ads in X-Men 97 issue 1. So Absolute Green Arrow, I just finished reading through that, and I've been seeing and hearing nothing but good things about it. And wow, that's all I can say. I'm not trying to spoil anything. I'm just trying to give you the general ideal of the theme of the books. Absolute Green Arrow was insane. I mean, the first 5 pages alone were just nuts. And they do a really cool thing in there where they kind of do some social media phone panels that are really kind of modern. It's kind of like catching up with the times in terms of this is how life is. You have a phone and a screen at your disposal, and you're getting most of your updates and news through that. And they kind of touch base with that in part of the book. That's about the only thing I can give up. But I mean, it's just, and I'm not a Green Arrow. I've never been, again, DC has always kind of been kind of like there, and there's certain things I'll pay attention to in the DC universe if I wanted to, and I've always appreciated certain characters. I've never been a Green Arrow guy ever, because I don't know, just never, it never reached out to me in any way. I know he's got a pretty huge fandom in himself, and so I was reading this, and it's kind of pretty cool what they did with Green Arrow, and some of the it's definitely not suitable for kids. There's some pretty graphic things in there in terms of reading through it that might even trigger some people. So just warn people now, if you're going to read Absolute Green Arrow and you've got some stuff you're emotionally going through, just be a little bit just read at your own pace, and then if it's not comfortable to you yet, just put it down. But it's pretty, in nature, it's pretty raw. I guess that's the best way to describe it. And it's just, yeah, everything that people have been saying about this first issue of Absolute Green Arrow is definitely pretty spot on. It's definitely pretty brutal, but it's cool. It's almost like if you could think of like the Punisher, how bad, I would say how bad, but how brutal the Punisher was and has been in his comics, especially in like the 80s and 90s. This is kind of like right up there. The Absolute Universe does not hold punches when it comes to action or anything that's just going to have you questioning why you are reading this series or whatever of books. So that's Absolute Green Arrow in a nutshell. Those were my 2 new reads. And then an older back issue, it's a trade paperback that I picked up a while back, and it's the Infinity Gauntlet. And I watched all the MCU stuff that was the connecting, obviously Endgame, Infinity War, all that stuff that is loosely based, and I say the term loosely based on Infinity Gauntlet comic line, because obviously when Endgame and Infinity War and all that was coming together for the MCU, they couldn't incorporate certain things into it in terms of other characters because they were owned by Fox or Sony. but although they still use Spider-Man, but regardless, I watched all the MCU stuff and I liked the way it cohesively came together in Marvel film form, and it was well done. And although it was missing pieces, there were certain variables that were not in the films that actually were more part of the comic book variation that it was inspired by, because we didn't get Adam Warlock until after Endgame with Guardians of the Galaxy 3. Had Pandemic not done a lot of things that shuffled things around, who knows whether he would have been there in time? Probably not. But the way they took Doctor Strange and Hulk and made that kind of that whole thing. And to go back to George Perez being the guy that was involved with all the artwork and storyline regarding Infinity Gauntlet, George Perez, he's a very, I don't even know how to best describe him. He's kind of got this, like, as a creator, he just kind of has this, I wouldn't say niche, but he's got this touch to his work that is very, you can see it in a lot of his work, and it has this very, it's like an aesthetic of sorts. He does things with his work that other artists and creators couldn't really do, and so I really enjoyed his touch with Infinity Gauntlet. And the funny thing is, I went from Infinity Gauntlet to Crisis of Infinite Earths, which also has George Perez involved on that as well, and it's just really cool how you could see the parallels of his work, because he's just got this, again, it's like almost like spotting a Da Vinci in the wild. You're like, yep, that's a Da Vinci right there. You could see that it's like his fingerprint, it's his identity, it's his mark that he puts on his work, that you just know that that's a Perez right there. And so that you get that with Crisis Infinite Wars or and Infinite Earths, you get that with Infinity Gauntlet. And so if you're a person who only pays attention to MCU films as your source of information for the storylines that they kind of change and have to put their own twist on based on who's available for them, I would definitely recommend reading Infinity Gauntlet, and then you can compare the notes between the two, because there's definitely some different things that take place with Infinity Gauntlet that are more there's definitely some more brutal stuff that takes place, although there's some pretty wild things that happen also in Infinity War and Endgame. But it's a totally different story, almost, Infinity Gauntlet, because of there's the connection to Death, Lady Death. You got the connection to Mephisto. Mephisto. I'm sorry, I'm not saying that correctly. There's all these different characters that are in the comic rendition of it that weren't in the theater or the movie version, that kind of make you take a different point of view on Thanos as a character. And again, it's just George Perez knocks it out of the park with both those titles between Crisis of Infinite Earths and Infinity Gauntlet. They're definitely and it's almost like he took one inspired almost the other, in terms of, because just like Marvel DC kind of do one, and it's almost like George Perez is almost like what James Gunn is now to DC and Marvel. He goes from Marvel and has this very unique approach to his films and his own fingerprint of sorts that are ID markers that you can see of who he picks as characters and how they react to each other, interact with each other. And it's the same thing he's doing at DC. There's so many people that are putting the parallels together between James Gunn's Marvel work and his DC work, where you can see kind of the same emotion and the aesthetic that he's putting together. And Perez has that same way, and it's kind of like an artist creator thing anyway across the board, because you'll see that a lot of times where Jack Kirby leaves Marvel, goes to DC, and you kind of see his unique touch on their characters. Same thing with Perez or Jim Lee leaving Marvel to go to Image and DC, or McFarlane. So it's just kind of, and I never used to pay attention to that kind of stuff before as a kid. It was just always like, this looks cool, I gotta have it. I might read a few pages, skim through, look for cool art panels, and that was my thing. And now I'm really more attentive to the creator aspect of it and can appreciate those guys a lot more. And so I always recommend that if you are new to comic books or you're just trying to kind of get back into it, like I'm kind of getting back into it, just pay attention to the names that are in the books in terms of the creators, the inkers, the line guys, the pencilers, the writers, the artists. It really kind of makes you have a bigger perspective on things when you're reading through books and tying things together. And then you find a whole new appreciation for that book as well. So yeah, those are the things I've been kind of dabbling with. I've got such a big stack of things that I got to read, and then tomorrow's new comic book day, so that's just going to add to that. I'm actually, I'll end with this note. I am running out of space for books. I had one 5-shelf bookcase, which to some was like, that's it, and it's already pretty well out of sorts. I'm a very OCD person, and I've been trying to keep it all in order, and now I'm getting in disarray with the month and with so many different projects and plans and everything else. So I'm doing my best to kind of figure out a new approach to what I'm going to start doing next. I've still got to get some bags and boards and start bagging and boarding more stuff that's come in. I've got other things that are arriving soon, more back issue stuff that I'm working towards. And I'll just say, with picking up new books now, like current titles, that I always never thought I would say that I am buying new comic books, just because there was nothing aesthetically, at least with Marvel. I'm not a fan of some of the way that Marvel presents their books from a cover value, because it's just, I'm ingrained in what I know from the 90s and the 80s with the little corner art and all the cool things that are kind of very retro nostalgic now. But I'm broadening my horizons to buy new books and in Marvel. And even if the Marvel stuff isn't landing or being well received on a comic book level, I'm giving some of it more of a chance. And I think that the one thing I will also say as I end this is that Spider Noir, even though it's Spider-Man Noir, when I went back to my comic book store over the weekend and picked up the X-Men 97 season 2 issue 1, I also went through some of their back issues, which they have like marked down to $1, and they're only within the last 5 years release. So I picked up the Spider-Man Noir #1 and #3. They didn't have #2, or if they did, they had it for a price that wasn't $1. I'm just finicky like that, or cheap like that right now. But I picked it up because the Spider Noir series on Amazon gave me a little bit, great job, Sony, because now you're helping me buy books again that I didn't think I'd ever buy, and now I want to kind of read into those, but I kind of want to get issue 2 before I go into those first 3 and start picking up on some of those. So Marvel, even though they're kind of in this weird, I don't want to call it a downward spiral, but they're kind of in this weird, like in boxing terminology, they're like holding on to the ropes. They have some things out there that you can kind of back issue a little bit and maybe find some appreciation in them. It's just a matter of what you're kind of into right now. I know that they're not really landing a lot of punches when it comes to new stuff, but I think I'm going to be optimistic, like I always am. I think they're optimistically trying to find some sort of grounding here to get back on course. And it's just a matter of if they can kind of limit their issue 1s and try to focus more on their main lines. So, but I think that it's just kind of representative of, if you go to Whatnot, like I do, and you follow certain sellers that are selling as they list modern comics or back issues, or, modern and old, they'll put old stuff out and it sells like hotcakes, so stuff from the 80s, 90s, even early 2000s. And then they put out, I've seen people run like Amazing Spider-Man Modern, which is still part of the Legacy line, I guess, but it's like the stuff that they redid in the 2000s, starting from 1 and whatever, and it just doesn't sell. And Amazing Spider-Man is a title that is very honored by fans, and either people just got too many issues of it, or they just don't need the new issues because they don't like the look of it. I definitely want to cover that down the road. I've been meaning to cover that down the road in terms of where I think the creators, the studios are winning from a design aspect. That it's completely my opinion. That'll be another episode down the road. But yeah, I'm starting to find myself buying Marvel books again, and I think part of it is too, I just want to have something to try to keep refreshing my current stock, because I could continue to buy back issue stuff like mad, but I know that I'm going to probably hit a roadblock with that. So I'm trying to kind of go back, like burning a candle at both ends is the best way to describe it. And I'm trying to find a little bit more stuff that I wish I probably would have gotten into or stuck with in later years. So with all that said, thank you again for listening, for putting up with me for 55 minutes and 48 seconds. And thank you. So again, social media, Chuck the Comic Guy, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Spotify, and Substack. I am going to do my best to keep continuing to post on there. I do it for all of you that keep supporting me and keep listening and being great fans and friends and followers. And until next time, see ya.
Let's cut out of here.